Being courageous. No matter what the circumstances, we are to be available for God to use us to carry out His plans in this world. Here's Dr. Gene Getz.
Well, during the Apostle Paul's incredible persecution in Jerusalem, and we've been studying that here as we've looked at principles from the book of Acts. But in the midst of all that persecution, tucked away in the text, Luke records a powerful little story that really illustrates this principle. And it has to do with Paul's sister and her son. In other words, we'll take a look at that in a moment and see exactly what happened. But first of all, we want to see that there's a plot. And this is where Paul's sister and her son comes on the stage. But here's the plot in Acts 23:12-13. When it was morning, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves under a curse not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. This is serious stuff. They're out to take Paul's life. Now notice there were more than 40 who had formed this plot. 40 individuals. So this is a huge conspiracy to take Paul's life. Now here's where Paul's nephew comes on stage. We read Acts 23, verse 16, "But the son of Paul's sister, hearing about their ambush, came and entered the barracks and reported it to Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, 'Take this young man to the commander because he has something to report to him.'" Now, the fact of the matter is, we don't even know the name of Paul's sister. We don't know the name of his nephew, her son. But we do know that he was a young man. In fact, in another text, it says that once this young man reported to the Romans that the gentleman, the commander, took him by the hand and led him to report this particular situation to higher authorities. So you can imagine he's a relatively young boy. And what a task that was. So here we read about, "But the son of Paul's sister, hearing about their ambush, came and entered the barracks." So we have a situation here where a young man was available to deal with this situation, to be used of the Lord. And it was very courageous. That's why I call this principle being courageous. Now, we don't know what the source of this was. We don't know how Paul's sister found this information. Could be a distant relative of other relatives, of people who knew, but there was a leak. And in God's providence, that leak came then to Paul and then to the Romans. And they acted on that. But I'm going to think about, for a moment, about this young man. And if he understood the scriptures at all, which he probably did, and we can assume, I think, that they were believers. They were true believers in Jesus Christ as the Messiah. That perhaps Paul's sister had taken her son and shared with him the story of Joshua and said, "Son, you've got a task ahead of you here." And maybe shared Joshua 1:9, which reads, "Haven't I commanded you, be strong and courageous?" This is the Lord speaking to Joshua, who is very, very fearful. "Do not be afraid or discouraged, Joshua, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." And so perhaps, as I said, these were the encouraging words that maybe this young boy's mother, Paul's sister, shared with him. It's an interesting story, as I said, tucked away here in Luke's narrative in the midst of everything that Paul was going through. And that leads me to a reflection and response question. Though we will probably never be faced with the awesome responsibility of exposing this kind of criminal intent, what are some of the challenges we face to be courageous in doing God's will? And one of the things that I like to think about in terms of applying that principle is being available. Just being available to the Lord to use us in challenging times, to take on tasks that call for courage. And since this was a relatively young man, I'd like to just speak for a moment to anyone who's young, as a young person today. And all of us know young people that need this challenge, and that is to be available to the Lord, to be courageous, to take a stand for Jesus Christ in spite of the persecution. And that's scary. That's scary in the world in which we live, because there are a lot of people that will make fun of us, call us nuts, call us old-fashioned. But the fact is that I believe God will honor you. God will honor all of us who apply this principle in our own lives. I know that I grew up in a religious organization where basically I was taught that I shouldn't fellowship with anybody else in spiritual things other than the people that I grew up with. And I was fearful to engage in spiritual discussions with other people. I wasn't to fellowship with them. But I was listening to Christian radio, and I began to hear an expanded view of my religious system. And I began to understand the truth. I began to study the Bible on my own, and I began to see what the will of God was rather than what I had been taught. And so consequently, the Lord encouraged me to study the Scriptures more. And I remember I was listening to radio, and I've shared this with some of you, one day, and I heard about this organization called Youth for Christ, and they were having a conference at a retreat center about 60 miles from our home in Indiana. And I was 16 years of age, and I was curious, and so I asked my parents if I could go, and I did. Took the car, my brother and I, and we drove and slept all night in the car, and the next morning I went to hear a young evangelist. It was the late Billy Graham, and I heard him speak, and that was before he had begun his worldwide ministry. And I remember that his message and what he says, I can't remember the specific words, but it really challenged me to be brave and to be courageous and to take a stand for Jesus Christ and for the Word of God, and to do it with graciousness, gentleness, and sensitivity. And consequently, as a result of that, I eventually went to Moody Bible Institute, and that changed my life in a remarkable way. So let's remember this principle to live by, which really applies to all of us. No matter what the circumstances, we're to be available for God to use us to carry out His plans in this world. And that takes courage.